Okay, who remembers what we're talking about? That's always my favorite question to ask at the beginning because it elicits blank stares a lot of the time, so that's always very good. Let's see. Oh, there we go. We're trying to work out the Kal V'Chomer. Okay, let's put ourselves into context. Who's the rabbi that we're dealing with over here? His name is Rabbi Chia. And Rabbi Chia says that we want to derive a Kal V'Chomer about the power witnesses have over a person who denies a financial claim against him. And the way we're getting to derive this Kal V'Chomer is from the power of that person's confession. Okay, so that's just like the very high level framing of what we're talking about. So a Kal V'Chomer, in order for a Kal V'Chomer to be a Kal V'Chomer, what has to happen is there has to be a Kriya Kal and a Kriya Chomer. Yes? Right? Okay, so what's a Kal?
Lesser.
A lesser, more lenient, easier scenario or law. And then you have a Chomer, which is a stricter, harsher, more difficult scenario, right? Kal V'Chomer. Okay. What's the Kal V'Chomer we're trying to build over here? It's that if somebody has a claim, financial claim against him, let's say, what have we been speaking about is a money, right, which is 100 zuz. So Reuven comes to Shimon and he says, you owe me 100 zuz. Shimon says, I only owe you 50 zuz. So in that case, the halacha is that he's got to pay the 50 zuz, obviously, because he's admitted it. And then what about the other 50 zuz? What does he do? He has to take an oath. What does that show you? That his confession is strong enough to make us believe we can force an oath on him to clarify the balance. Okay? That's that. Then you have a different scenario. Reuven comes to Shimon. He says, you owe me a money, which is 100 zuz. And Shimon says, I owe you nothing. Now witnesses arrive, and the witnesses say, what are you talking about? You do owe him something. You owe him 50 zuz. So now, how much does he have to pay? 50 zuz. Why? Because witnesses are compelling, right? They have to. Okay. The question is, does he have to take an oath about the balance or not? So Rabbi Chia says, well, to me it makes sense that he should. Because if his own confession elicits or requires him to take an oath on the balance, surely witnesses who are surely stronger, there's the Kal V'Chomer, who are surely stronger than his own confession, surely should also then make us impose an oath on him because maybe he's avoiding the other half of what's being claimed from him. So that's what we got up to. Okay? So then we had a question. We say, whoa. Hang on a second. What do you mean that witnesses are stronger than confession? We have a principle which is confession equals 100 witnesses. In other words, in a financial case, if a person acknowledges debt, that is in fact the strongest proof. So don't tell me that witnesses are stronger than confession. In financial terms, they're not stronger than confession. Okay? So effectively, what are we doing over here? And we're going to keep doing this. We're going to say, we're going to test this Kal V'Chomer. Does it really make sense? Is it really true that witnesses are stronger than confession? Here is a very straightforward, you said A, it's actually B. You said two witnesses are stronger than a confession. Actually, the principle is, in financial matters, confession is king. Confession equals 100 witnesses. So what are you talking about? How could you build this Kal V'Chomer? To which the Gemorah said, you don't understand. We weren't talking about a regular financial claim. Obviously, everybody agrees. If I come to you and I say, I owe you money, nobody's going to say, no, you don't. Obviously, if I say I owe you money, I owe you money. That's why we call it like 100 witnesses, because there's no better way to get money from somebody than by their admission. But there's another kind of money, another class of money. Why would a person make a false admission about a debt?
Protect somebody else.
Tough luck, you made that mission. It's money. It's not going to tarnish your reputation. In a criminal case, we don't accept confessions because you're not allowed to tarnish your reputation criminally. But if somebody has a financial claim against you, In the same way as I could decide to give you a gift, I could decide to tell you I owe you money that I don't owe you. What's the downside? So I'm protecting somebody else. So what? Did you get your money? You did. Did I want to give it? I did. No issue. The only time it's an issue for a person to confess something is criminal matters. We do not accept criminal confessions in Jewish law. Which brings us to this category of money that we're going to be talking about. It is something called a knas. Does anybody recall what a knas is? Knas? Aidan, we're relying on you.
Something about a cat.
Nothing to do with a candle. Knas is a fine or a penalty. So, can you think of an example of where a person has to pay a knas, a financial penalty? Can you think of an example?
You mean in Torah times?
In Torah, yeah, in Torah times. No, nowadays would be running a traffic light.
If you got caught stealing.
Stealing, right? If a person was caught stealing, then the punishment in halacha is that they've got to obviously replace the value of what they stole, or the original item if it's still intact, plus a penalty of 100% of the value of the item. So that penalty falls away if the guy confesses to stealing. What does it mean confesses to stealing? Again, you can't confess to a crime, but you can confess to the financial aspect of the crime. In other words, so Reuven steals Shimon's wallet, and in that wallet is $1,000. If the Jewish police, whatever it was, the Beis Din's police, if they catch this guy with the wallet with $1,000, he's going to be liable now for 2,000. That's the penalty. If Shimon feels bad, that wasn't a good idea. I know it was whatever, it was a lapse of judgment. Whatever the case is, if he afterwards realizes that was not the right thing to do, and he goes back to Reuven and says, "Listen, I want to give you your wallet back," we say, "Thank you very much. We appreciate that you've owned up. Given the wallet back, off you go." There's no criminal record in Judaism. Okay, so because he's owned up, he does not pay the knas. He does not pay the penalty. Whereas if two witnesses testify that he stole, he does pay the penalty. So what does that show you? Witnesses are stronger than a confession. Just depends on the circumstances. So can you see, this is like a seesaw. We're trying to balance which is the one that carries more weight, confession or witnesses. If at the end of this discussion, witnesses definitely carry more weight than confession, then Rabbi Chia's argument stands. Well then, if the lesser mechanism, confession, is enough to make us impose an oath on the guy for the balance, then definitely the stronger mechanism, witnesses, should elicit that same requirement. But if at the end we're able to prove that witnesses are fundamentally stronger than confession, then Rabbi Chia's point is not valid, and then we don't make the guy take an oath in a case where witnesses say that he owes part of the claim against him.
I'm going to say, can it be turned on its head? Because either the witnesses are going to be stronger or not.
Correct, so it's one or the other.
Then the guy who confesses it becomes a that will work as a kal v'chomer, right?
If the witnesses are stronger, then the kal v'chomer works.
So then the guy is forced to take an oath
for the balance that the witnesses did not testify about.
Yes.
Yes.
And if it comes out that witnesses are not stronger, does it work the other way around?
Well, if
he has to take an oath anyway.
No, that one is mandated by the Torah. The Torah tells us clearly that he has to take the oath in the case of his partial confession. So that's not being debated. We're just debating if we can extrapolate from the Torah's case to another case we don't have clear information in the Torah. So we want to know, is the Torah expecting us to apply a logical principle over here and conclude that in the case of witnesses you take an oath? Or are they just totally different cases? And the Torah decided that that's the law in that case, and there's no bearing on a situation where witnesses come forward. That's essentially what we're trying to balance over here. So that's where we got up to last week. And basically at this point, if the money example we're using is offset by the knas example, we still don't know if this kal v'chomer is genuine or not. Okay? Asks the Gemorah, Effectively, what you're telling me is that because a person cannot be liable for a penalty by their own admission, but they can be liable for a penalty by the testimony of witnesses, that tells me that witnesses are stronger than admission. If that's where you're up to, the fourth last line on page 38, then I'm going to ask you this question. Okay, so you're convinced that the person's admission is not as strong as witnesses, and therefore you are convinced that Rabbi Chia's Kal V'chomer works. That's where we're up to. I'm going to ask you, hang on, here's a case where I will prove to you that a person's admission is stronger than witnesses. Again, you want to enforce, you want to endorse, you want to support Rabbi Chia's Kal V'chomer. For Rabbi Chia's Kal V'chomer to work, it has to be that witnesses are stronger than admission. My question is, here's an example I'm about to show you where admission is stronger than witnesses. What's that case? So it's going to be something called a korban. The only thing with the korban is it's not going to be straightforward either. Okay, let's have a look. Fourth line from the bottom. Ma lepiv. 1 second, did we not do all this? Oh, we didn't do this. We just spoke about it outside. Oh, okay. Sorry. Right, okay, let's go to the top of the page. Top of the page. Knas.
Penalty.
Thank you. Good.
Pontius Pilate's pet.
Okay, ma le toimar be. Okay, so what does that mean? That's an expression that goes ma le. What about X and Y? Toimar be, would you then say about A and B? In other words, you wanted to compare two cases. Now, this ma le toimar be is going to play a role a few times over here. You're trying to compare two cases, right? You're trying to compare that if a guy admits to a knas, he does not have to pay it. Therefore, admission is weaker. If witnesses prove that he has to pay a knas, then he does have to pay it. That proves that witnesses are stronger. That's what you're trying to say. I'm going to ask you, ma le, what about another aspect you haven't considered? In that case, toimar be, would you be able to then apply it to the witnesses? In other words, you're telling me, on evidence that you've shown, that witnesses are stronger than admission. I'm going to bring you another case and say, what about in that case, where actually it's the reverse? That's ma le. What about that case? Toimar be, where you're not going to be able to say what you wanted to say. You're not going to be able to make the comparison that you wanted to make. You're not going to be able to prove the point of the Kal V'chomer in the way that you wish to prove it. In other words, ma le toimar be is basically introducing the fact that we're going to undermine the argument you've just put forward. Because we're going to be saying, your argument works until you introduce other information. Once you introduce that other information, it upsets the balance.
But is he saying that if witnesses testify to something, your confession can override what the witnesses have testified?
No, we haven't suggested that.
Because you're just saying that it invalidates the need for witnesses.
Correct.
But isn't that two different things?
What do you mean?
Because the witnesses only come if the guy's dishonest.
Not if he's dishonest necessarily.
Well, if he's not telling the truth.
No, but he could have forgotten.
Yeah, okay.
It's not implicit that he's dishonest. The loan was 10 years ago. It's not implicit that he's dishonest just because there are witnesses who say differently to what he says. Okay?
Where it goes, yeah.
Okay. Next is an important halachic principle, which is moide biknas patur, that a person who confesses to a crime for which there's a financial penalty is then exempt from that penalty. Again, he's not considered a criminal. You cannot prosecute somebody criminally for an admission, but here we're only looking at the financial component. So the penalty which is the financial component, falls away in a case where he confesses to what happened. By the way, if you think about it, it fits perfectly logically. If I cannot prosecute somebody criminally for their confession, the penalty is the prosecution of the criminal deed. So that's why there's no penalty for his admission. It's the same principle. Principle is there's financial restoration by his confession. Yes, because financially I could decide I owe anybody anything in the same way as I could give it to them as a gift. But the penalty is a criminal punishment. You can't punish somebody criminally for their confession. So it's the same principle, just applied in a different context. Okay, so I didn't realize we hadn't done these verses, so these are very, very important verses. Number one, we actually looked at this pasuk earlier. Remember when I say earlier, I mean in this conversation. This is the same section of the Torah that taught us that if a person denies part of the claim against them, the Torah expects them to take an oath for the balance. It's from the same section. Literally a few words after what we're going to read now. So this is a case of theft. And the Torah tells us, Ad hoilikim yovoi devar shnehem. What happens is, there's Reuven says, I believe that Shimon stole money from me. And Shimon says, I don't know what you're talking about. So, ad hoilikim yovoi devar shnehem means their case has to come to the courts. This is one of the places in the Torah, it's not the only one, where the courts are named Elokim. Then the courts have to make a decision. Asher yarshiun Elokim. The party who the court decides is guilty, that party, Yeshalem Shnaim L'Re'ehu, will have to pay double the value of the stolen item to the victim. In other words, there's a victim and an alleged perpetrator. There's a victim and an alleged thief. They've got to go to the courts. Asher Yashiun Elokim. The one that the court decide, should the court, a better way to say it, should the court determine the guy to be guilty, the alleged thief, determine him to be guilty, then Yeshalem Shnaim L'Re'ehu, that thief will then have to pay double the original value plus 100% penalty. What's the Torah telling us in this case? The only time he pays the penalty is if he is found to be guilty, implying if he comes forward to admit guilt, he does not have to pay the penalty. That's the implied message of here. Only the guy who is found to be guilty has to pay the penalty. If he comes forward of his own accord, he does not have to pay the penalty. Okay, so that's the biblical source for this.
When is the latest you can
own up?
Yeah.
Good question. What's the latest that you could own up? Until the court proceedings are called for, basically.
So even if you take an oath or like all of that, you can still admit.
Well, if in a case of being accused of theft, there's not going to be an oath. So it's just simply the witnesses will come forward. The panel, the court panel, will test the witnesses to see that they are telling a story that sounds beyond reasonable doubt, and then he's going to be told that he's got to pay. There's no oath in the process. So basically, until they walk through the courts, the door of the courtroom, he has the chance to own up and get out of it. And by the way, that is not unique to this case. That is generally the case in all prosecutions in Judaism. Until the proceedings begin, a person can step forward. Again, you can't declare yourself a criminal. So in a criminal case, it doesn't really help. But there are certain cases where it does help, even if they're like marginally criminal. If you know, in other words, like the case of the Sota woman who's accused by her husband of infidelity. So she gets, until the process begins, she gets the opportunity to admit, and then they don't go through the whole procedure of the Sota, and unfortunately they have to get divorced because she's admitted infidelity, but she doesn't get prosecuted. So it's not only in financial crimes.
So then you can't confess once court proceedings have commenced.
That's right. You can't confess once court proceedings have commenced. Yeah. Okay, so that is the knas that is relevant to the first part of the Gemorah on this page. The part that is relevant to the second Gemorah on this page is this verse. The pasuk says, V'haya ki yeh sham la'achas me'ele. It will be when a person is guilty of one of these sins, v'hisvado asher chata oleha, and he will confess the sin, and then he has to bring a certain offering, which we're going to learn about, a certain korban, which he brings if he confesses his sin. That already gives you a clue that what's going to happen next is the Gemorah, once it's resolved the issues around money, is going to move to the next example, will be something to do with a korban, as we shall see. Okay, let's understand.
Sorry, just to interrupt 1 second. So, in other words, if you can't change your plea from not guilty to guilty in the court proceedings.
You cannot change your plea from not guilty to guilty in the court proceedings. In other words, if they've already, court proceedings meaning that there's already been testimony, then you can't change your plea at that point.
So it has to be then proven. You can't
Correct.
say, okay.
It has to be proven. That's right. Once the court is in session, it has to be proven. I mean, I don't know if it's as an exact a science as I'm making it out, because the circumstances might also dictate, if they'll accept a confession at certain times. Like it's not.
It would make sense to do that. It just eases the burden for everybody. Because
That's right.
Okay, listen,
That's right. That is right.
okay, I'm prepared to. Okay.
Like a plea.
Yeah.
Totally a plea.
Just again, remember that this is only relevant in financial crimes because
Sure.
there's no room for confession in other areas of criminal law. So the benefit is the guy needs the money, he's going to get the money. But here, when we're dealing with a penalty aspect to it, I don't believe that once the court proceedings have started that you can now get out of the penalty because you know the case is going against you by making a confession. Whereas if it was just, let's say, a loan where the person denies the loan, and now the court proceedings have happened and they admit the loan, there's no penalty that they're escaping, so there's only benefit in their admission. Are you going to ask something?
I was going to say you could change the plea, but probably pay the penalty.
No, but
So
if you're
if I'm guilty,
admitting,
then
then
pay the penalty.
if you're admitting, then the penalty.
Then the
no
penalty
longer
falls
applies.
away.
But
So
once it started,
that's it.
then
You
might as
can no
well-
longer,
Well, then you might as well
input
take
the
your
penalty.
chances.
yeah.
But it might cost
So it's
you
actually
money.
encouraging you to go for
No,
it.
it is.
That's an interesting question in its own right, which we're not going to get into now, is were there costs associated with a court appearance? The whole notion of paying, there's no lawyers. The judges cannot be paid by the community. I'm saying by the litigants, because that could skew their perspective of justice. And there are no penalties built into the guy who lost the case having to pay court costs or things that we're familiar with. That didn't exist in those days. Or I shouldn't say in those days, in the Jewish court system. So the judge is a public servant, so he's paid from the coffers of the community generically rather than from the people participating.
What is it currently? Is there currently a punitive cost that essentially against an unsuccessful litigant?
It's a good question. I don't know. I actually have, believe it or not, I have zero real world experience in a Beis Din. I've never had occasion to be in a court case in a Beis Din in my life. So I can't. I don't know. I don't have real world experience.
You've got your reputation to lose, maybe. If they
You're saying the person has the reputation to lose if they
guilty
are found to be
and
guilty.
they said, maybe that's the. I mean, that's the side.
Yeah. Seeing as you've mentioned it, the greatest risk to reputation is for the person who lies under oath. If a person steals and makes restitution, there's no record of it. We don't keep a criminal record. There might be a conversation in the community, don't do business with so-and-so, he's crooked. But there's no formality of associating a person's past with their record, which is really interesting. Another whole conversation in its own right. Okay, let's just briefly go back to the bottom of 37. Just to remind ourselves, where we were is we're trying to support Rabbi Chia's Kal V'chomer. How are we supporting his Kal V'chomer? Because we want to show that witnesses can achieve what confessions cannot. So where did we say that? We say, look, in our case, when the guy admits to part of the claim against him, his admission does not force him to have to pay more than what he admitted to, right? He does have to take an oath, but he doesn't have to pay more than what he admitted to. Whereas if witnesses come along, he does have to pay more than what he admitted to, because in the case of the witnesses, he admitted to nothing. He's going to have to pay whatever the witnesses testified to. So that gives the impression that witnesses are stronger than a confession, right? That's what we learned last week. The Gemorah said, hang on a second. You're taking a specific example and you're making a broad statement that witnesses are stronger than confessions. And we reject that broad statement, because actually confession in financial matters is like 100 witnesses. That's where we left off last week. To which the Gemorah says, you don't understand what I meant. Ever had one of those conversations where you're having a debate and then the person says, but you didn't understand what I meant. So the Gemorah says, so the Gemorah says, what is the type of money we're talking about? My mamoin. What money were we referring to? This is now on page 38. My mamoin. What money are we referring to when we say that witnesses can make you pay that money, but you yourself can't? What kind of money we were talking about? Knas. We're talking about a penalty. And if we're talking about a penalty, then this is how the Kal V'chomer works. Here's how the Kal V'chomer works. Uma piv. Let's consider a person's confession. She'ein mechayvoi knas, which will not make him liable for a penalty. Because we know that, right? Fundamentally, you never pay a penalty for something you admit. So, ma lepiv. What is the power? What is the extent of a person's admission? She'ein mechayvoi knas. It's not strong enough to make the person liable for a penalty. And despite not being strong enough to make the person liable for a penalty, it still is strong enough, mechayvoi shavua, to make the person have to take an oath. So why is admission the kal, the lesser case? Because it can't get you to pay a penalty. So it's less capable. It's weaker. It can't get you to pay a penalty. Therefore it's kal. Whereas witnesses can get you to pay a penalty. Therefore they are chomer. They are stronger. So therefore, einoi din, is it not then logical? Shemechayv in oisoi shavua. Is it not logical that if he, by admission, can obligate himself, can land up in a situation where we impose an oath on him, even though he cannot land up in a situation where he is liable for a penalty. So then if the witnesses can get him to pay the penalty, surely they can make him liable for the oath. That's the logic that we're saying. The weak admission is enough to have to take an oath, so the strong witnesses surely must be enough to make you take an oath. This is how we're trying to explain Rabbi Chia's Kal V'chomer. Remember, we're going to keep doing this. Rabbi Chia said something, it's a Kal V'chomer. We thought we understood the Kal V'chomer, we knocked it down with a question. So now we're giving another option. Well, maybe this is how you're supposed to read the Kal V'chomer. And in a moment, we're going to knock it down with another question. And that's how we're going to keep testing this Kal V'chomer. Okay, any questions at this point? Because it's vital that we have this really clear before we go to the next piece. Okay, I'll tell you how we're going to do this. Let's do this a little differently. You tell me. Okay, I'm serious. Let's just feed it back. In order for a Kal V'chomer to work, what do we need? Principally, not this specific Kal V'chomer, just generically. What do we need in order for a Kal V'chomer to be valid? We need one weak case and one strong case. If there's no clarity that one case is weaker and one case is stronger, you can't have a Kal V'chomer. Okay, so the first thing we need is one weak case and one strong case. Great. According to Rabbi Chia, which is the weak case and which is the strong case? Confession is the weak case and witnesses are the strong case.
The witnesses can get you to be more than
Correct, because witnesses can make you liable for more than your admission can. Good. Now, assuming that that's all correct, assuming that witnesses are stronger, And therefore we have a Kal V'chomer. What is Rabbi Chia learning from that Kal V'chomer? What's the practical takeaway in our case from that Kal V'chomer?
For the balance.
Okay, is that part? Do we know that from the Kal V'chomer? How do we know it, Aidan?
Because doesn't it say it?
Because that is said in the Torah. The Torah says that if a person admits to part of the claim against them, they have to take an oath on the balance. So what does Rabbi Chia want to learn out of the Kal V'chomer?
That the witnesses can also make you take.
That witnesses can also obligate you to take an oath on the balance. That's what he's trying to build with the Kal V'chomer. Again, admission is weaker, witnesses are stronger. Admission can make you take an oath on the balance, therefore naturally witnesses must also be able to make you to take an oath on the balance. Okay, that's how we're constructing the Kal V'chomer.
So, like, would they make you take the oath because they want to, or is it just like...
Great question. So would they make you take the oath because they want to? No. Their job is they know information, they feel a moral responsibility to come to the court and report that information. They don't necessarily even have to know what the court is going to do next. Now it's the court's job to say, we have that information, let's use it to impose the oath on him according to Rabbi Chia, because Rabbi Chia believes in this Kal V'chomer. Okay. Then we said, 1 second, you're actually describing a scenario that has to do with how much money you have to pay. And you're telling me that in a scenario of how much money you have to pay, that in that scenario witnesses are stronger. I have a problem with that. Because normally in paying money, confession is stronger than anything. Confession is like 100 witnesses. So your Kal V'chomer is based on the thought that witnesses are stronger than confession. But we don't necessarily agree with that. Witnesses are not stronger with than confession with financial matters. Okay? They're not. To which the Gemorah, as we've just read, says, yeah, but we weren't talking just about any kind of financial confession. We're talking about a very specific kind, the knas. The knas is a penalty you only pay if there are witnesses. Your confession is not strong enough to instigate a knas. So if you can't make yourself have to pay a knas, but you can make yourself have to take a shavua, then witnesses who can make you pay a knas surely must be able to make you take a shavua. That is where the Kal V'chomer is sitting right now. Okay? Says the Gemorah, okay, so in that specific relationship, witnesses or confession relative to a knas, the witnesses are stronger. Accepted. Here's another scenario. What's the other scenario? Malapiv. What about confession? Shekein mechayvoy korban. When a person admits to wrongdoing, they have to bring a sacrifice as part of their atonement. Toimar be'edim. Are you then going to apply the same, are you going to try to compare that to witnesses? She'ein mechayvin oisoy korban, who don't make you have to take a sacrifice? Okay, let's understand what's going on over here. Somebody breaks Shabbos. God forbid. Somebody breaks Shabbos. What do they have to do now? They have to atone. And how do you atone? You bring what is called a korban chatos, the so-called sin offering. Right? Are there witnesses that the person broke Shabbos?
Not necessarily.
No. Why not? Because if there were witnesses, the person would be stoned. They wouldn't be bringing a sacrifice. Do you see that? There is an example where confession is stronger than witnesses in the context of the Korban, not in the context of the laws of Shabbos, because the laws of Shabbos is just one example where the witnesses will invoke a greater penalty. But in hundreds of examples, or I should say dozens of examples, where a person would have to bring the chatas offering, in all of the cases of a chatas offering, it can only happen in the absence of witnesses. The minute there are witnesses, there's no chatas offering. What would there be? Whipping, stoning, depending on the scenario. So in the context of a sacrifice, confession is stronger than witnesses. My confession makes me have to bring a sacrifice. Witnesses don't make me have to bring a sacrifice. In other words, Rabbi Chia, you made such a strong claim that confession is kal and witnesses are chomor or chomer, right? The word is chomor, but in kal v'chomer, right? I don't want to get too technical about grammar. Okay? So you made that claim broadly, but actually you were really talking specifically. You were actually only talking in the case of finances. Because the minute you step into other areas of Judaism, that's not the system. Confessions are not weaker than witnesses in other areas of Judaism. Here's one, a korban, a sacrifice. And a sacrifice is a case that can only ever, well, the chatas offering can only ever happen by admission, can never happen by witnesses. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yes, but there are other punishments in those cases that are contingent on witnesses. They cannot happen by admission. You're right. We're going to get to various scenarios as we go. Right now we're looking at this specific scenario. In the context of the obligation to bring a sacrifice, confession trumps witnesses.
But witnesses aren't relevant. They're just not there.
What do you mean they're not relevant?
They're not there. They're just,
Yeah, but if they were there, you wouldn't bring the sacrifice.
No, I'm saying. I mean, you've trying to recap it 100 times, and I still don't know. Because I think witnesses never play a role if somebody gives an admission.
That's right.
So then.
That's right. Okay, so let me put it to you this way. Witnesses and confession never play in the same space. Okay? Yeah. If it's a confession, witnesses are moot. If they're witnesses, confession is moot.
Well, confession, no, not necessarily. Then the witnesses would trump the confession.
Yeah, but my point is, we're not looking at the two as a competition. There's not witnesses in the red corner and confession in the blue corner. There's a scenario where there was a confession versus a scenario in the same legal context where there were witnesses. We're never talking over here about the two butting heads. Witnesses first in the same thing. No, we're talking conceptually in this legal framework, which is the stronger element, witnesses or confession. Not in this case. I think it's an important distinction to make. So it's important that you raise that. We're not talking in this scenario. We're talking in this legal framework. In the legal framework of penalties, witnesses trump confessions. In the legal framework of sacrifices, confessions trump witnesses.
But that doesn't invalidate here because he's playing in a very specific space.
Well, is he? Is it fair to say that Rabbi Chia is playing in a very specific space? Rabbi Chia is saying, I want to make a kal v'chomer. A kal v'chomer is a logical construct. And the logical construct says, this is weaker, this is stronger.
But is it universally applicable across?
If I'm saying this is weaker, then it must always be weaker. And if this is stronger, this must always be stronger. If that's not the case, that's fine. It's just not a kal v'chomer. Maybe there's another method that you could use to work this out, but it's not the kal v'chomer method. Okay?
But if you come to this
just one little piece that there is obviously a common thread over here, which is we're talking about people being obligated in Jewish responsibility. We're not talking generically. We're talking in a certain thread. In terms of people being responsible to their Jewish, people being liable for Jewish responsibilities, is confession stronger or are witnesses stronger? That's what we're discussing. You think of obligations just in terms of money. Guess what? This is Judaism. There are other obligations, like a sacrifice. So in terms of becoming obligated to fulfill something, guess what? It's not kal v'chomer as you thought. It's not as clear-cut as that. It's not that always the witnesses are stronger. Because in my responsibility to effect an obligation of Judaism, here's an example, where I'm stronger than the witnesses.
Kal v'chomer has to be a universally applicable.
Kal v'chomer has to apply to what I'm trying to achieve. What am I trying to achieve over here? I'm trying to achieve the power of one mechanism versus the other mechanism to make me liable for a responsibility. When we started the conversation, we thought that was a financial responsibility, but that was too narrow. If we want to understand the essence of what witnesses are and the essence of what confessions are, then we need to understand how they operate in the world of Jewish liability or responsibility, not just in the narrow space of money.
Sorry, I still don't see the relevance of this korban, because could there be a case where a guy breaks Shabbos, God forbid, and okay, he comes and he gives the korban kachas. But what if two people come and say, hold on, I actually saw him?
Great question. Great question.
Then it would be. Then the witnesses would stone him.
No, they wouldn't.
Or they'll say, thanks for the sacrifice, but actually...
They wouldn't, and that's why this is such a good question. This is such a good question, because seeing as we've now crossed a border, we've moved away from just plain finances, which may or may not include criminal intent, and we've stepped into the world of transgressions, which is different. In other words, is it a transgression to steal? Yes, it is. Was that what we were debating? No, we were debating the financial responsibility one has for stealing. When it comes to breaking Shabbos, that is not a financial issue at all. It is only a transgression issue, right? That's all, there is no financial component to it.
Thank God. But we often do that. We say, listen, I'm going to do that, but I'll give you charity too.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that that doesn't mean it's the Jewish. Doesn't mean it's the Jewish way. It might be the Jewish people's way, but it's not necessarily the Jewish way. You know, can I pay in advance for my sins? You know, kind of thing. Okay, so here's the thing. Let's use Shabbos as an example. So, in order for a person to be prosecuted for a transgression, the witnesses had to have been present before the transgression, and they had to have warned the person against the transgression and then seen them do the transgression in order to testify. So there isn't a scenario where the person could confess if there had been witnesses. Had there been witnesses, there is no scope for confession, because the witnesses warned the person before and don't do this. If he does it, then they take him to court and they initiate the proceedings against him. Right? So there's no scope for confession in that scenario, because the witnesses are not a surprise. The witnesses are essential to how this transgression happened. So you can never have a possibility for confession and a possibility for witnesses in the case of a transgression.
What if the witnesses don't honor their responsibility of taking him to the...
That's a good question. If the witnesses don't honor their responsibility to take him to the courts, they have transgressed now, because it's a mitzvah to testify when you are a witness to something.
So where does that leave the original person?
The original person. Oh, that's a good question. So if they don't go to testify, can he still bring a sacrifice? I stand to be corrected. I don't believe that he can, but I stand to be corrected.
Yeah, but then, if witnesses can never play a role here, then what's the point of bringing it in?
What do you mean if they cannot play a
You're
role?
saying that
They have to play a role.
They
can't, no, on the transgressions.
on a transgression, they play a role. It's just a different set of rules for how you become the witnesses in that case. So
No, but you just said that you can never have a guy transgressing Shabbos because the witnesses have to pre-warn him, tell him,
no,
etc.
you cannot have a person be prosecuted for transgressing Shabbos without witnesses. You can never have a person bring the atonement sacrifice for a transgression with witnesses. So these are the two options. Either there are witnesses and no sacrifice, which is exactly Rabbi Chia's, the Gemorah's point on behalf of Rabbi Chia. See that? Witnesses cannot obligate the person to bring a sacrifice. Or there are no witnesses, but this person feels guilty that they did something wrong and they want to atone, and therefore they're bringing a sacrifice, which would prove his point that, you see, your confession is stronger because it makes you bring a sacrifice. No, that's fine. We're at the end, so you can...
No, because the witnesses got a different role there.
What's their role?
The witnesses in the financial... like you said earlier, the guy may have forgotten. The witnesses come in and say, "Yeah."
You're
did take the
absolutely
money.
right. The witnesses
But
in
yeah,
a
it seems like the witnesses can never be in that, or the transgressor can never be in that role.
Okay,
like,
so
there's
let's
no
speak.
point in the witness.
Let's unpack this. So, witnesses in a financial case and witnesses in a transgression case are very different witnesses with very different roles. In other words, in order to be a witness, you still have to be an adult, Jewish, male, whatever. Fine, but the type of witness that you are is a different witness. And in halacha, we're not going to get into it now. In halacha, we speak a lot about different kinds of witnesses in different scenarios. For the purposes of our conversation, the witness to a transaction could be incidental. So you happen to walk past, you happen to see the transaction take place, make a mental note, you and your friend, and say, okay, in case anything goes down, we saw this happen. And they don't even have to know that you exist. I mean, usually they would know, and even much more likely they would have signed on the contract or whatever the case is. In the case of witnesses for a transgression, they are not halachically considered witnesses unless they warned the guy immediately prior to the transgression, and only then can they testify against him. So a person who had that kind of warning leveled against him has now forfeited his opportunity to confess. But confess doesn't mean he goes to the kohen and says, "Forgive me, Father, because I've sinned." Confess means he goes to the farmer and he buys the animal to take to the kohen and say, "Please bring a sin offering for me." But the point is, as soon as he has defied witnesses and said, "Don't do this," he's forfeited his opportunity to bring the sacrifice. So they're very different witnesses.
But that's the same as saying transacting in front of two witnesses. You are witnessing a transaction. Then you basically forfeited your right to deny it
No, you haven't.
because you've got two witnesses watching you.
That's fine. But if
but
I
you
have
know
two,
that it's not gonna- you
if
know
I have
that
two
you're never
witnesses,
gonna be able to,
no, if I have two witnesses who see a transaction, those two witnesses are not taking me to court. They have no obligation to take me to court.
Yeah, but they're witnesses.
Well, one second. They have no obligation to take me to court, right? The only time that those witnesses will ever play a role is if this deal now goes sour. The claim against me is lodged against me, and I deny it, right? And I might deny it because I might think maybe the witnesses have emigrated, maybe the witnesses have died, maybe they couldn't be bothered to come to court. It's very different from this scenario where the witnesses now have an obligation because they were privy to this transgression, and they decided, they got themselves involved in this. They decided to approach the guy. They decided to give him the warning. Therefore, they are now obligated to take him to court. That's a very different type of witness.
You could say it's like a contract witness, like, when you sign a contract with a deal, they're like there to, it's like, if, I don't know, it's like, if there's a contract, it's like, you definitely committed a crime, but like, there, if you have those two witnesses and they warn you, you've definitely committed that,
That's right. There's still a difference, though, because if I have witnesses to a contract, that doesn't mean I'm going to break the contract.
Yeah.
That's like a safety net. Whereas if there are witnesses to a transgression, that means there was a transgression.
But then how can you ever confess? Because you've got witnesses that saw you.
That's the
If
point.
you transgressed,
That's exactly the point.
you can't actually-
That's exactly my point. So, confession and witnesses to a transgression are mutually exclusive. They cannot exist in the same case. Either they were witnesses, or there's the possibility of confession. Can't be both. In a transaction, there is room for both. It's possible that there are witnesses, and it's possible that the person takes the chance of denying owing the money, believing that maybe the witnesses won't rock up or they won't be reachable or whatever the case is. They're not mutually exclusive. It's obviously you have the witnesses because you want to avoid that kind of denial, but it's not mutually exclusive. In the case of a transgression, it's mutually exclusive. Either it's witnesses or it's confession. Can't be both.
Well, they're not passive witnesses anymore. They're very active.
They're not passive. Exactly. Totally different kind of witness. They are very proactive witnesses. Just to make it a little bit more interesting, should it be a capital case, those witnesses have to be the ones to play executioner. So they are very active witnesses. They know exactly what they're getting into, and they've decided to approach this person and give him the warning, etc. They are very active witnesses. And despite all of that, they still can't make him take a sacrifice, which is the Gemorah's contention at this point.
So I mean, in the terms of when you get married and you have the two witnesses for the
Those are witnesses to the fact that you'll be executed.
Sorry, Brett.
no, but my point is that you have the two witnesses for the ketubah. So now, if you don't honor the ketubah, those witnesses are obligated.
Not at all. So the witnesses at a wedding are now another category of witness where they are there just to give validity to the ritual. They're what we call Eidei Re'iyah, basically, which means they see it happening. And if somebody wants to know, was this person ever married, they can testify that that person was married. But they're not really playing a role that has a direct legal impact on default. They're there to play a role that we have people who know that this event happened.
Okay.
Just another question. You're saying, if I understood you correctly, that when you're dealing with a transgression, the witnesses have to warn you not to do what you're about to do.
In the case of a transgression, the witnesses have to warn you, and they have to warn you immediately before the action. They can't warn you an hour before.
Okay.
It's got to be in the heat of the moment.
So how do you warn somebody to do something that you don't know that they're going to actually do?
Good question. So part of the job, in fact, the key reason that you have witnesses is to determine intent. So if the witnesses come over and say, it looks to me like you're about to light that fire on Shabbos, maybe you've forgotten that today is Shabbos, or maybe you've forgotten that you're not supposed to, so don't do it, because if you do it, they have to say this, if you do it, you're going to be punished. And the guy turns to them and says, I don't care. That was their job. Their job was to make the clarity of his intention. Because then you can prosecute him if you know his intention. You can't prosecute somebody because you've guessed his intention.
Correct.
So if you bring it up and then they say, "Oh, thanks for telling me, I won't do it,"
Then they've achieved their objective.
right?
Exactly.